Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming Danielle Smith.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here today. And I thought I left in plenty of time, but then I had to stop and gas up my car. And I was sitting there frustrated because there was one person in front of me thinking, gosh, this is taking forever. And I used the speed pass so I can go through quickly. But the rest of the drive down here, I got to thinking, what would my day have been like today if I drove an electric car? I don't know if you guys saw during Black Friday in the United States, there are a lot of rich guys in California who own Teslas, and they thought they'd take them out for a spin all at the same time on the same day shopping. And they have this charging station down there. It's supposed to be a quick charging station, 40 charging stations at a time. And the lineup of Teslas stretched out kilometers from the charging station because as they overloaded it, it kept on slowing down the charging. And so everybody ended up waiting for hours, literally, to get their vehicles charged. I just mention that because I think we have a bit of a delusion about how quickly we can transition away from fossil fuels. And I think it's kind of encapsulated today with the announcement that Greta Thunberg is the Time Person of the Year. Like, I'm not sure when somebody's going to tell this poor girl that what she is advocating, that we be completely off fossil fuels by 2030, is impossible. But I'm hoping that with this conversation today, that I can maybe convince you of that there might be a path to a slower transition, but also to just make you aware of the grave threat that I think you are under. And I don't want to see happen to you what I've seen happen to so many industries before you. So let me explain a little bit of my background. So for those of you who haven't, I've been out of politics for a little while, went back to what I did before, which was media. So I'm able to speak a little bit more frankly than when I was in politics. And one of the people who interviewed me shortly after said it's like I've been Febrezed a bit, because I'm able to speak off fairly straightforwardly. And this is important, especially on this issue. First of all, I should probably ask you, how many, I don't know if this is just crops or if it's crops and cattle. How many of you are cattle? A couple, but mostly crops? Okay, good. That'll help me sort of frame some of my comments. So I got into the issue of environmentalism probably the way most kids do. So the first Earth Day, you may recall, was in 1970. So I was born in 1971. So I grew up my entire life being told that the world was coming to an end because of one threat or another. I mean, I still think I've got residual concern about an ice age because that was what everybody was concerned about in the 1970s when I was a kid, and it was related to sulfur dioxide. But you know what happened there, and this again has been influential in my thinking on environmental issues, is that they developed a market for sulfur dioxide, put a price on the credits, and they ended up reducing them to a point where they were no longer worried about an excess buildup of aerosols in the atmosphere. And then they switched to talking about the ozone and the depletion of the ozone because of chlorofluorocarbons. Well, they fixed that too. And then it's morphed into greenhouse gases, which is far more complex, but in some ways just as simple. I mean, if we were able to solve the problem of sulfur dioxide, and we were able to solve the problem of chlorofluorocarbons, this is really just a new permutation of the same problem, isn't it? Well, I think it isn't, and I'll tell you a couple of the reasons why. Part of my deprogramming, I'll call it, when I finished my English degree, was in the middle of my economics degree, went to the Fraser Institute. And my first project there was called Environmental Indicators for Canada and the United States. We took an American study and we brought in the Canadian data to just look at how things had gone in North America since the 1970s, since the first Earth Day. And you know what we found? Looking at air quality indicators, looking at water quality indicators, looking at solid waste indicators, looking at protected land areas, everything was going in the right direction. In the case of air pollutants, massively so. We saw a dramatic reduction in lead, dramatic reduction in sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, all the pollutants that have genuine harm to human health and the environment. So I ended up going through that experience thinking, my goodness, we keep getting better and better at this. And that capitalism and free enterprise and innovation and entrepreneurship is the answer. It can solve pretty well any problem that's put in front of us. The reason I mention this is because the Rio Earth Summit happened in 1991. So this was before my experience at the Fraser Institute. I was there in 1996. And that's where greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide in particular got put on the table. Now in this initial study that we did back in 96, I remember having this conversation with my colleague. We chose not to include carbon dioxide in our measure of pollutants because it wasn't actually a pollutant in the way that you think about all of those other indicators that I had just mentioned. But that shows you how much things have changed just in the time that I've been watching this issue closely, from 1996 until now. It is now, I would hazard to say, the only issue that environmentalists care about. The only issue that our Prime Minister cares about is greenhouse gas emissions. And how did this happen? I think we have to maybe go back and look at some of the changes in the environmental movement, because when you look at the establishment of Greenpeace, part of what they began about was saving the whales. And after they finished saving the whales, they had to move on to something else. They had to fight the nuclear threat. And after the nuclear threat, they had to find something else. Because part of what you're now seeing with the environmental movement is it's become a bit self-perpetuating. As soon as they solve a problem, they have to find another problem to solve for mission, for one reason, but also for fundraising. And so what ends up happening is that each in their turn, an industry becomes the target. So the first time I watched this happen was the demonizing of our foresters. Remember Clayoquot Sound? Because I lived in Vancouver for a period of years. And so I watched as people chained themselves to trees and equipment to prevent them from being cut down. This notion that you couldn't cut any trees down. We saw it turn into secondary picketing. Our foresters here ended up finding that all of the places that they were sending their wood for processing down in the States, they ended up putting pressure on them. It ultimately ended up getting resolved, and I thought what was a reasonable way at the time, this Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, where they agreed on a number of different measures for how the industry would constrain itself, and as a result, they'd be allowed to continue on. I don't know if it was that successful, an agreement, looking in hindsight. If you look at the serious problems that we now have with out-of-control forest fires, part of that goes to this environmental ethic of you can't cut down any trees. Well, if you can't cut down any trees, and you're not allowed to harvest them in a responsible way to make sure that you're removing excess fuel, when they do catch on fire, they burn unnaturally hot, and they can't be stopped, or they incinerate the land as they go, and so it makes it more difficult for the land to be replanted. So this is sort of the downside of being overly strident about how we manage our resources. I look at our foresters, for instance, same way I look at our food producers, as the front line of really managing our landscapes. And I'm really hoping that now we're about to see it come full circle with our foresters, with the new initiative that's been announced by the federal government during the election to plant 2 billion trees. So let me leave that for a minute, I'll come back to it, because I think that's also an opportunity, but I think it may also be a threat to your industry, and I'll tell you why. So after they finished demonizing trees, the next industry to get under attack was the oil sands. And if you've looked at the work of Vivian Krause from Fair Questions, she traced this back to 2008. Now, I don't know why I didn't really know about this when I was in politics. I think I knew about Tides Canada. I knew that Stephen Harper had been looking into whether or not their charitable works were funding appropriate things. But I had worked at the Fraser Institute, and the Fraser Institute also received funding from American foundations. So I don't think I really thought that it was too much of a threat. I didn't think they were really doing anything that was that much different than what some of the conservative think tanks were doing. Here's the difference. When I met with Vivian Krause and Cody Battersill, who was doing a lot of work on this front, they sent me the strategy documents for the tar sands campaign, that's what they called it, from 2008, and the strategy and the PowerPoint that went along with it. And it was a group of American foundations and Canadian environmental groups that got together with the purpose of demonizing and landlocking Alberta oil. Now, the strategy at the time was that they had had such great success in demonizing coal. Coal, I guess I probably should have talked about coal as kind of the other industry in the middle there, but they'd had such success at demonizing coal, they were seeing that in North America, that financial institutions were reluctant to fund any new coal-fired plants because they didn't know if it would become a stranded asset with the constantly changing regulation. They wanted to create that same level of uncertainty with oil sands. And it's interesting, as you read through the strategy document, they bemoan the fact that people don't know how terrible oil is, and they'd have to try to take extra effort to make sure that people think of it in the same dirty terms as they did with coal. Why did they pick on Alberta in particular? Well, they looked at America and where they were getting and using the bulk, or producing the bulk of their emissions. And they found that it was on transportation fuels. And there were really only two major places that they were getting transportation fuels from internationally: Saudi Arabia and Canada. Now, I don't know if you've tried to protest in Saudi Arabia lately, but it doesn't go very well for those who do. They end up chopped up in pieces. So I think just straight up pragmatically, they said, let's cut off the supply from Canada. And because we had just had the breakthrough on oil sands, it gave them the opportunity to look at it on a per barrel basis, what the greenhouse gas emissions profile was, determine or brand it as the dirtiest barrel of oil, and the rest, I guess, is history. We also had the issue of the ducks that happened somewhere around the same time, 1,500 ducks dying in this Incrude pond, and so the narrative ended up taking over. You know what's so interesting about it, though? The strategy was to landlock our oil, prevent us from getting international pricing, choke off the industry, hoping that Americans would stop using transportation fuel based on oil. The whole premise was, we're going to switch those American drivers over to electric cars. Well, guess what happened? We developed technology in Canada, Packers Plus, horizontal multi-stage fracking, and it created a shale boom in America. Now America is the biggest producer. So the strategy got blown out of the water. You'd think that they would focus now on their own industry in America, but I think the money must be too good. And so they continue to focus on Canada, even though it's pretty clear that the strategy has been a complete failure. Now it's being exposed. So I give Premier Jason Kenney credit for listening to Vivian Krause during the campaign. He's launched his war room today. It's called the Canadian Energy Centre. So we'll begin to see some of the myths around the industry getting addressed. Now, this could be why we're now seeing the third target for the environmentalists. So about last January, Lancet and EAT, an organization, collaborated to produce a study to say that the only way to save the planet from excess methane emissions from burping cows is that we all need to reduce or eliminate beef consumption. Their recommendation was reducing beef consumption by 90%. What was interesting about this, and the reason why I followed it, is because it had all of the distinguishing features of the same kind of campaign as the tar sands campaign did. It launched in 40 major cities around the world simultaneously. Within a week of it coming out, lo and behold, our Canada Food Guide changed, and everybody was being told that they should eat plant proteins instead of animal proteins. So you began to see this battle shaping up, and I will give the beef industry credit because they responded. They responded quickly. Every single time an erroneous piece of data was put into the public or saw it in the media, they responded to it. And in fact, so much so that there was an updated article from Lancet where they gauged what the social media war had turned out like. What happened is that organically, this hashtag called yes to meat, yes, number 2, meat, started being the channel that everybody was talking about this issue on. So that when they looked and did an assessment of was there positive coverage or negative coverage or neutral coverage of our report, it was overwhelmingly negative. So you can fight back and you can win. But what you can't do is what the energy industry did, is just think they need us. I think a lot of food producers for a long time have thought, well, they need us. They're not going to attack our industry. I think that's changed. And I think the next battleground, I don't think the one with beef is over. I think they're going to continue on that one. But first they came for the foresters, then they came for the oil sands, then they came for the cattle producers. Now they're coming for you. And the reason I say that is because of the demonization of natural gas. For me, as I've been watching this issue, I should tell you where I come from on the issue now so that you don't think that I'm, oh my goodness, the word they use, a denier. I want you to understand that my position on this is that because I have observed that we have been able to eliminate all kinds of emissions from all kinds of sources, I look at this as a technological problem. So I've spent the last 4 years interviewing everybody I can who is working on the issue of carbon capture. And it is astonishing what we can do when we have captured carbon dioxide. You can capture it, you can turn it into sodium bicarbonate, you can make soap, you can turn it into carbon nanofiber, which is even stronger than steel. So it has a whole pile of applications when it comes to construction. You can use it in construction materials. You can turn it back into a fuel again. Like, it's almost as if, thank heavens, we learned how to capture carbon dioxide, because who knew it was going to be this useful? So I feel very strongly that there's a technological solution to the fact that we're going to keep on burning fossil fuels for our everyday needs, including our food needs, and that we will just resolve the problem by addressing greenhouse gas emissions with offsets, with sequestration, as well as with carbon capture. So that's where I come from on the issue. I don't think that that is where the climate extremists want to go with this. I've interviewed a lot of these environmental groups, and one of the things, I want you to sort of picture the vision of what it is that they think we can do. And I want you to go through the exercise I did driving down here, thinking, what would my life be like if this is what I had to rely on, if this is all I could do? So what their vision is that everything will be operated off the power grid. So think about that. So all of your current electricity uses, all industrial electricity uses, all heating converted to electricity, all transportation for all sources, passenger, the work that you do in your fields, the work that you do getting your crops to market, all electrified, all operated off battery power. And then on top of that, the only legitimate power generation sources are wind and solar. So as you're thinking this through, how am I going to dry my grain with wind and solar powered batteries running fans? How am I going to transport my products on a train to market to get them to China? How is that China transport container ship going to get there on wind and solar? Like, you see, if you're sort of thinking through logically how this is going to work, you realize that it's not going to work. It can't work. It was never designed to work. And so why are we pretending that that is the solution? And that's what I've been trying to get to the bottom of. There's a wonderful environmentalist that I would recommend that you read. His name is Michael Shellenberger. And he one year was called the environmental hero of the year. And I really think he is, because he cares about emissions, he cares about greenhouse gases, he wants to do something about it. But he's come to the conclusion that nuclear is really the only answer. And I've often wondered, if you are so concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, why isn't that the obvious one? Same as well with hydroelectric power. In America, they don't look at hydroelectric power as being green power. It's part of the reason why Quebec sometimes faces barriers in getting its power exported to the US. They don't look at that as being green power. Why not? And I guess there's a couple reasons. Every single source of energy that we use has some kind of environmental impact. And so you have to gauge what level of impact are you prepared to live with. So some people aren't prepared to live with the issues of spent fuel when it comes to nuclear. Some aren't prepared to live with the issues of destruction of habitat and destruction of fish habitat in the case of hydroelectric. But the more important reason is that if you were to base your economy on nuclear and hydroelectric power, you wouldn't need wind or solar, right? Because why would you use an intermittent power source that you'd have to build 3 times the capacity to cover you off if you could have a reliable fuel source that was running all the time? So I think that's one aspect to it, is somehow this entire green movement has been captured by the solar and wind billionaires. And I think part of the quid pro quo is those are the only 2 solutions that they put forward. But as you just thinking through for yourself whether or not it's possible, and not just possible, but possible by 2030, possible within 10 years and 1 month. Think about how quickly we would have to move to get there. Think of the issues of upgrading our power grid to get there. Think of the changes in your business operation to get there. Shellenberger argues that wind and solar were never meant as a solution to power an industrialized economy. That the people who are putting that forward don't want an industrialized economy. That he's gone back and looked at who the original advocates of wind and solar were, and they were return to the land. The world's overpopulated. Have sustainable farming where you're making all your food local and you don't have to export anything. So that is where our 2 visions are clashing. Because I think those of us who live a modern, urban, in my case, industrial lifestyle, we kind of want that to continue. And we want to find solutions that will allow that to continue. I think we have to realize that those who don't support the range of options that we're putting forward, they don't really want to have an industrialized economy continue. Now here's a reason why natural gas is so important to your industry. Like I'm an urban person who loves food producers, so I know that everybody in this room knows more than me about agriculture. But someone I had on my radio program really nailed it, and it got me wondering, why aren't you guys speaking out about this more? Because this is really serious. If you think about the idea that natural gas and fracking has been so demonized that the environmentalists want to keep it in the ground. Those are the words that you will hear. What does that mean for the production of fertilizer if we don't have any natural gas available to us by 2030? I'll tell you what it means. So David Nabhan is a science writer, and I had him on recently after a column that he wrote. And one of the things that and I want to just read this to you. You probably know this, but let me just tell you why it was such a revelation for me. Naturally generated fixed nitrogen last year and every year supports a population of approximately 3.8 billion people. So without the ability to create our own fertilizer, then we would be stuck with only having the capacity to feed 3.8 billion people. Yet there are 7.5 billion of us, giving rise to one of the most astounding facts. Half of the nitrogen compounds in the DNA of the chromosomes of all 30 trillion cells in our body, half of it is artificial. It's cooked up in ammonia factories around the world, meaning that half of us wouldn't be here without the Haber process. Some 500 million tons of fertilizer is produced via the Haber process every year, requiring 2% of the world's energy to apply the heat and pressure demanded to force nitrogen pumped from the air to bond with hydrogen to form ammonia. To acquire that hydrogen, an astonishing 5% of the world's natural gas production, methane, 2/3 of which is extracted in the hydraulic fracturing in the subterranean rock layers with pressurized fluids in the US, is fed into chambers and mixed with steam, where both compounds react to give up their hydrogen components. Now, this is serious. So what does that mean if we've got a group of vocal advocates saying no more natural gas by 2030, and all of our projections show that the global population is going to go to 9.8 billion people by 2050? Well, it means half of us are going to starve to death. And so I don't want to put too fine a point on that, because that is, I think, the sinister underbelly of this movement, is they actually think there's too many people on the planet. And so they're engineering these regulations and these arbitrary deadlines to phase out our use of fossil fuels without telling the public what this means. And maybe it's because I'm pretty anti-communist. My dad ended up having to go to my social studies class when I was in grade 8, because I came home saying, oh, my teacher, Mr. McCarthy, he thinks the Soviet Union's fantastic. My dad didn't think much of how Stalin starved 40 million of his own people, and so he went and told the teacher that. But then we started talking more about politics. But when the state gets serious about eliminating its population by depriving them of energy and food, they're very successful at it. So this is why I am very concerned about the fact that natural gas, which used to be the cleaner burning fuel, that's how it was when I was growing up, has now been demonized in this way. And it's got a double hit. It's not only for those of us who are using it for energy, but it's also for the production of food. So why aren't you guys talking about it? Is it because you think that the costs are manageable? I went and looked this up, and I think the Western Producer calculated the costs. So we're going to go to $50 per ton in carbon taxes under this administration within the next few years. So that's going to cost you $3.85 per acre of additional taxes, they calculate, for the cost of propane for drying grain, railway costs to move the grain, the average cost to move the grain from the farm to the grain elevator, trucking, cost of delivery and heating of farm buildings, and the electrical cost increase to your farm operations. So that doesn't even count the increasing cost of an ammonia, and they didn't do it because it was so variable they couldn't figure out a way to do it. So I went to another source, and so if you happen to include fertilizer, that's an additional $2 per acre when the carbon tax goes up to $50. So we're now at a point where you're spending essentially $6 an acre in taxes that none of your competitors around the world have to pay. So I'm a consumer, so I don't know how that works out into your competitive pricing internationally. Is that not a big deal, or is it a big deal? I don't know how it works out with consumer prices. What does it mean for me? This is where I think you can do some good work, is helping to bridge that information gap. What do these prices actually mean to our food prices? Because it gets more serious. Because the Eco-Fiscal Commission, which advises Justin Trudeau, has said that $50 per ton isn't near enough to get people to change their behavior. It needs to go to $210 per ton. So I did the calculation on that. At $210 per ton, when you calculate all of this together, you're now paying $25 per acre, more than your competitors around the world who aren't having to be exposed to these same taxes. So is that sustainable? Can you do that? What does that mean for you? Can you keep your operations going? How much more will it add to your operations? And what will be the cost to consumers? I don't have that information. I'm just telling you where the government policy is going, and just observing that I'm not really seeing a pushback from your industry, which is making me wonder, maybe it's not such a big deal. Where it gets to be a big deal, though, is do we end up seeing far more dramatic actions because the Greta Thunbergs and others of her ilk who are uncompromising are saying that we've got to be completely off fossil fuels by 2030. I don't know what kind of additional policy measures that will mean, but I can tell you what's happening now in Holland. I don't know if you've watched, it's surprising to me, you could get 10 Greenpeace activists hanging off a bridge in Vancouver, and it's wall-to-wall international coverage. But you get thousands of farmers going to The Hague, lining up their tractors hundreds of kilometers, and we're not really getting much coverage of this. So what is the issue that's happening there? Well, they're bringing through a nitrogen tax. And I thought, what is this about? Why would you have a nitrogen tax? Everybody's been talking about carbon dioxide. Well, nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. And so they're putting severe restrictions on Dutch farmers about how many animals they're allowed to own and how many crops they're allowed to plant. And so everybody, justifiably, is freaking out. And so their solution is, oh, well, let's just make sure we've got the same regulations applying to all of Europe. And so when that happens, how long before we start seeing those same regulations here? I don't think that it would be very long at all. So I'm making you aware of this because if you're worried about what you've seen happen to other industries, I think that there is a great deal of concern that we should have about what's going to happen to yours. I see this quite differently. I don't worry too much about overpopulation, because I think you guys will produce enough fertilizer to be able to meet the demand for food around the world. I've seen it happen, and so I believe that you can do it. I believe we can feed 10 billion people by 2050 if we're allowed to. What I would say is that the extreme environmentalists have the exact wrong solutions. They're arguing that collectivism and Marxism and communitarianism and deindustrialization is the future. And so you've got 1.3 billion people on the planet in 2015 that will live the kind of lifestyle we enjoy if they don't take it away from us, but 7.3 billion people on the planet who aspire to our level of wealth and our standard of living, who will be urbanizing. And you've got a UN body that's prepared to stop that from happening. Like, I question the ethics of that. How can you stop 7.3 people who are living in poverty or near poverty from enjoying the same quality of life that we do? I think the real solution is the opposite. The real solution is capitalism and free enterprise. Look what it's done for us. Because what happens when women get educated and women start working, they end up having fewer children. If you have fewer children, you've got more means to be able to spend money developing yourself, buying a home, and improving your quality of life. When you start improving your quality of life, you look around and say, gee, we better clean up that river. We better find proper sanitary sewage for waste disposal. And I don't think we should be cutting down trees or using cow dung anymore to cook our food. I think we should get some natural gas in our homes. And so you start seeing that wealth not only addresses the population issue by slowing population down, but it also addresses the environmental issue. Because then people, because they're not worried about starving to death, begin to worry about the environment. And so this is the premise of people like Bjorn Lomborg, another environmentalist who I greatly admire, who says that our dual purpose should be to not only address environmental issues, but also to bring up the impoverished of the world to our standard of living. And it's really only a handful of people who are saying that. Where I hear that most often is at conferences like this, or when I'm at energy sector conferences, and that should really tell you something. Here's the threat and the opportunity, I would say. I'll try to leave a few minutes for questions if you're interested. I see that there's a couple of mics there. The question I have is, how do we get back to some kind of balance and some kind of sanity? And I think we are on the cusp of getting there, because during the campaign, and I think I'm alone on this, but I'm going to put the premise forward anyway. The move to a net zero carbon emissions target is actually one that Canada could achieve quite easily. And the way we could do it is by exporting our LNG to China and getting offsets credited back to us to reduce our emissions profile here. Just one of these plants, LNG Canada, should be able to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 60 to 90 megatons. You end up doing that with 7 or 8 different plans, both here and on the East Coast as well, because there's another project that's underway out there. Pretty soon you've completely offset the 716 megatons of emissions that we have. Then you layer on top of that all the carbon capture technology that we're talking about. Heck, if we can take nitrogen out of the air, then why can't we take carbon dioxide out of the air? So that would be another aspect. But I think that you are very important in the third aspect, because you've got Justin Trudeau now talking about planting 2 billion trees. Calculation I've done on that, each tree sequesters about a ton of carbon dioxide over its lifetime. 2 billion trees is 2,000 megatons. But that's not even the best way to sequester carbon dioxide. You guys know that. The best way to do it is in your soils. And not only does that benefit you by having better organic material, but it also allows you to generate a credit, which you can then turn around and sell and turn into a source of income. And the reason I mention this is because during the campaign, you may have seen that Justin Trudeau had 2 cargo planes, or 1 cargo plane and another plane that his staff traveled on. And he got called out on that. And when his answer to that was, well, I'm by emissions offsets. So therefore, that's how I justify having these 2 planes, is that I'm offsetting my emissions. So I contacted the company that he bought the emissions from, and they're called Less Emissions. I said, well, how did you generate the credit that the Prime Minister was able to buy? And there's a dump in Windsor that they captured the methane off of, and now they flare it. And because the methane's not going up into the atmosphere directly, and they're burning it, that created enough emissions offsets for the Prime Minister to fly 2 planes. I said, you've got to be kidding me. Like, flaring methane is not what we would look at as being the highest level that you can get to for environmental objectives. And well, that's just the way it is. That was one of the projects that they used. So imagine if that is something that warrants an emissions credit that you can sell. I think it's $40 a ton that you are buying it for on their website. How much do you guys think that you'll be able to generate? You do a baseline on your soil right now, test it again 5 years from now, show how much carbon you've sequestered in your soils, and then all of a sudden you've got a credit that you can sell, becomes a new source of revenue, or an offset to the taxes that they're expecting you to pay. So I would just plant that seed with you. I think that that is a way that you can get a win here, because I think there's also potential to get a loss. Because some of the places where they do tree planting, and 2 million trees is a lot of trees to plant. Part of what they do is they take over farmland and replant trees on farmland. That's one of the measures that they've taken in other jurisdictions. And I don't want to see your industry put at odds with the government agenda on this, because I think you can be part of the tree planting. Someone told me that we used to have a shelter belt program that was eliminated. That should really come back. I mean, that's part of the solution, right? But also it allows for you to, I think, make the case that because we've got such productive land, that allows us to create more food off smaller spaces, which creates more room for the planting of trees and forest. And I think that the agendas could potentially be in sync, but I think it takes work to make sure that you're at the table and leading that discussion, as opposed to responding to it from a defensive point of view. So I put all those things out to you because I do think that this is a hard conversation to have, because I know anytime I talk to a room, half the room says it's all crap and we shouldn't have to do anything anyway, and why are we doing this? This isn't really in some ways a scientific argument anymore, it's a political argument. And from what I've just observed of the industries that have been hammered by being passive, by thinking we are needed, there's no possible way government would go after us. They've been the ones who've been targeted, who've been caught behind the 8 ball, and then you have to do a lot of extensive lobbying to turn things around. I think that you have such a great story to tell about food production, providing the world with healthy food. You also can support the veganism movement, which is really strong with the young kids. You can capture and sequester carbon dioxide. You can help to build or to plant trees on marginal lands to meet the Prime Minister's objectives. So I don't see that there's any reason why your industry can't come out ahead, except for the fact that we have natural gas in the eyesights of the environmentalists. They want to stop it, they want to stop fracking, and I think there needs to be a positive message in order to be able to counter that. So that's, I will leave you with that, because I was sort of almost a high note that I was ending on, but I do leave it as a bit of a cautionary tale, because I've just watched a lot of misery in this province unnecessarily over the last number of years. When you look at the boom that they're having down in Texas and the whole belt going on to the Gulf Coast, that should be ours. But because we have an industry that was passive on keeping their products to market and on fighting some of these issues early, we find ourselves landlocked, and we find ourselves sort of the victim of these international forces. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Excellent presentation, Danielle. Thanks very much. I think sanity doesn't really live in this space very much, and it's very difficult. I like the watermelon analogy. You hear the watermelon analogy, that a lot of the green people that are green, they're green on the outside, but really they're red on the inside. And it's not really about greenhouse gases as much as it is about social re-engineering and making sure that anybody with wealth doesn't have that wealth. And I think that's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, well, it is, and it's a confusing one to me. I've been trying to figure this out, because the guy who got this all started was Maurice Strong, a Canadian. And he, as you may know, was the head of Power Corp. And so he was involved in the Laurentian elite sort of block of power brokers in the East. He was a CEO of Petro-Canada. And it's sort of shocking to me that somebody who made his wealth off of a capitalist economy turned around and wanted to destroy it. And it could well be, and you see this a lot actually, when you look at the group that was behind the tar sands campaign, it's the Rockefellers group. I mean, they made their money off of the energy sector. When you look at Justin Trudeau's obsession with greenhouse gases, his family wealth comes from a series of gas stations that his grandfather owned. So it's almost like there's, I don't know if it's, well, I made my wealth, but now you can't do it, or if it's, I made my wealth this way, and I'm so ashamed of it that I'm now going to overcompensate by really tackling this industry. I haven't figured out why that is, but there's certainly a common theme there.
I've heard some theories that it's all white person guilt. But how do you counter somebody like a Greta Thunberg, and such an engaging, shame on you, and it just captivates everyone? How do you counter that kind of media sensationalism and the media coverage she got, that she was an instant hero?
You fight teenagers with teenagers, is what I've determined, is that if you try to have an adult bring a little reality into this conversation, then it's, oh, you're beating up on a kid and shame on you. But there are a lot of young voices that are emerging. I just played on my show today a young woman by the name of Naomi Sept. I'm not sure if I'm saying her name right. If there's any Germans in the room, you'll have to tell me. It's S-E-I-B-T. Anyone know how to pronounce that? In any case, about 4 years ago, she was a full-on climate alarmist, and she's a German girl, and she would call people who expressed doubt, what are you, a climate denier? Knowing, as a German, what that implication was. And she says she's now horribly offended if anyone uses that term now. But one of the things that she noticed is that as she started, her moment of awakening happened when Germany was dealing with its migrant worker crisis, and it created a lot of social issues there, and no one was allowed to talk about it. So she started trying to find out why that was, and it kind of unraveled a lot of issues for her about feminism and identity politics and intersectionality and all of this other stuff. And that's when she started questioning the issue of climate science. And one of the things she said, and this is all I ask for too, is she's very insightful in saying that this isn't science that we're dealing with anymore. The scientific method is that you have a hypothesis, and then you test it. You go out and you see whether the empirical data supports your hypothesis. And then you reach a conclusion. And if you've done good work, another scientist should be able to come along and replicate your method. Everything we talk about with climate science is projections. It's typing information into a computer model using different degrees of flexibility for the impact that carbon dioxide has, and then you end up with projections that we're going to have a 2-degree increase or a 4-degree increase, oh my gosh, or a 6-degree increase, and they don't ever match it with what has actually happened out there in the real world. So her observation was they come to their conclusions having never tested their hypotheses, and she just thinks it's an effort to not have us proud of what we've accomplished. We've accomplished so much in the industrialized economies of the world. We should be proud of it. We shouldn't be ashamed of what we've accomplished. And so I played that today and I thought, wow, you know, if a 19-year-old girl is already able to see all of that, we might have some hope in being able to address that. So there's a lot of young people who I think are having that moment of awakening. I mean, for me, it happened at 25 when I was at the Fraser Institute, realizing everything I've been taught was taught in a skewed way. And once you begin to see the other side, you actually can become quite zealous and in trying to undo some of the misconceptions that others have. So I think that we're beginning to see that movement happening.
Excellent. Questions for Danielle? I'm not supposed to monopolize this. Yeah, here, grab the mic over there.
Oh yeah,
It's
there's
probably
mics up here
close.
too if you want to, so that I can hear you better as
Yep.
well and so everyone else can hear you.
Danielle, I always thought you should have been our premier, but anyway, that's another subject. My question
Now
to
you're
you
going to get
is-
me booed. Like every room I come into, half the people are still mad at me. So no boos. Okay, thank you.
So my question to you, and I do love your radio program,
Thanks.
almost as much as those late night talk shows out of the U.S. and all their political comedy, but my question to you comes down to, who would you rather seen as Person of the Year? Because I understand Donald Trump was also another possibility. Who would you rather have seen as Times Person of the Year, Greta Thunberg or Donald Trump?
I don't hate Donald Trump. I know that might surprise a number of you because he seems to have a lot of detractors. But one of the things that he is doing is that he is challenging conventional wisdom. He's saying the unsayable, and people are shocked and astonished. What do you mean you're questioning the mandate of NATO? What do you mean you're challenging Justin Trudeau on stage about how much he's spending on defense spending? I mean, I kind of like the fact that he has a brash style. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out for him. I will mention this. After his impeachment yesterday, or the articles came forward, the Democrats realized that they needed to give him a win on signing the USMCA. And so it was sort of a good day, bad day, but he ended up leaving and going to Pennsylvania. He went to Hershey, where 17,000 people showed up to watch him in a rally at the arena, and there wasn't enough room, so they also were outside. 17,000. The population of Hershey is only 14,000. Pennsylvania is a state that used to go Democrat. So I think the Democrats have played this completely wrong. And my prediction is that it fails in the Senate, and then he goes on to win a second term. So I certainly would not have given it to Greta. I do not know that Donald Trump has done enough yet to warrant Person of the Year. I still think we've got problems with North Korea that didn't turn out quite as he had hoped. And he hasn't got the deal with China settled yet. So I think he's got a little more work to do. But why wouldn't they have honored the men and women who are fighting for democracy in Hong Kong? Why wouldn't they have honored the people who are standing up and trying to fight for democracy in Iran? Like, these are the people who really are risking life and limb for the kind of freedoms that we take for granted here. So that's who I think would have been more worthy of the time honor. I don't think that there is any point or purpose in continuing to indulge the delusion. The delusion that we can be off fossil fuels by 2030 is simply impossible. And I think the more that we indulge that delusion, the more terrified young people we're going to create. And I think that kids are already anxious enough, the stories I get, about young 11-year-olds coming home not wanting to eat beef tacos because their teacher told them that cattle were destroying the planet, or 11-year-olds who are crying and terrified because they think we're all going to go extinct because we're still putting gasoline in our cars. I think that's really irresponsible. So she's the last person, I think, who should have got Time Person of the Year.
Other questions for Danielle? You know, a very lucky conference here. Danielle could have been Premier of Alberta. Alana Cook was this close to being Premier of Saskatchewan. She was lost out to Scott Moe in the leadership campaign when Brad Wall announced his retirement. So pretty amazing conference here in Lethbridge, Alberta, to have two people that were that close to being Premier. Other questions for Danielle?
Thank you so much for the presentation. Big fan of your show.
Thanks.
I guess it's not really so much a question as an observation. Yeah. You're preaching to the converted here with your common sense and your information from all perspectives so we can draw an informed conclusion. It seems to me that the size of the challenge is so high because we live in an era that to me is a relatively new thing. Here's an example. On the Calgary News Hour on any given night, one of the top stories might be about a cat or a dog. Mm-hmm. And then down the line, there'll be a story about humans or children and the mistreatment that we manage to do to those. So it seems like common sense and the scale is so out of whack. I'm just not sure that we have enough people left with common sense to counteract that huge scale difference.
I understand why you're saying that. And maybe the challenge that you've got in crops is that you don't really have one voice, because you've got, I mean, I'm speaking to you here, I'm going to another farming conference in Banff tomorrow, and I could probably, it's probably a lot like the energy industry, where I could list off, 10 or 15 different organizations. And the question I would have is there any table where you come together where you can develop a common strategy? This, I gave a strategy session to an energy company one time, and that was what I recommended to them. I said, get the guys from CAP and CPAC and the CAODC and the others like joint venturers and gas fitters and whatever else, get them all together in one room. And they'd never done that before. And in the time that I've spoken with them since, they had brought everyone together. And everyone was like, wait a minute, what are you trying to do? Is this some sort of takeover? And there was a lot of posturing, but it was, no, we need to figure out a common way of addressing this. The second piece of advice I gave them, though, was to reach out to the other industries who are impacted by the same issue. Because I think natural gas is such a great story. And if I could see CAP focusing on the natural gas story, and then you've got an industry spokesperson for crops who are walking in lockstep saying the same thing, then that becomes something that you can build on. So the other aspect is get all of the celebrity chefs. No celebrity chef wants to cook with electric. I mean, they all want to cook with natural gas or propane, right? Because they're not doing any hookups anymore in California. And you've got the chefs who are saying, what am I going to do here? They're bringing in propane instead because they're not getting hooked up by gas. So there are, I think, ways that you can leverage what you have with your other industry groups, but then also piggyback with the work that is being done with the natural gas industry. They've woken up. I mean, they're now producing energy minutes. I interviewed a young woman today who is doing these little 3 and 4 minute videos that are targeted to, I played some of it on the air, targeted to probably like a grade 6 or grade 7 audience, with links for teachers so that they can download it, talk about it in class. I would say that why not do the same thing, agriculture minutes for the young kids so that they understand where their food comes from. I do love to tell this story, and I'm sorry because I know it's always boring when you hear the same joke, but for those of you who have heard this before, I think it's important to understand how far removed the urban consumer is from the work that you do as food producers. And I used to tell this story when I was traveling around the province as a politician, because my young niece, Emily, she'd not ever been to a farm before. So her parents decided to take her to a petting farm one day, and they're playing with the goats and playing with the lambs and playing with the chickens, and that was wonderful. And then they went home and had dinner, and Emily said to her mom, "Mom, isn't it neat that they've got the same word for different things?" And Carrie said, I'm not sure what you mean, Emily. So, well, there's the chicken on the farm, and then there's the chicken that you eat. She didn't know that they were the same thing, for the same word for the same thing. So she became a vegan for a while after that. But that's the disconnect that we're seeing, is that young kids don't know where their food comes from, honestly. There's also another opportunity that you have. I've really gotten addicted to these homesteading videos. There's a group of young people who are sort of, they're growing up in an urban environment, maybe student loans. They're looking at housing prices, having to pay $600,000 for a house. They want to have a large family, and they can't afford it. So they're going out and buying 5 and 10 acres, and they're seeing how much of their own food they can grow, and then they're posting this all online. So there is a resurgence of this growing your own food, finding out where your food comes from, eating local, that I think that you can really capitalize on. But I'm not seeing the same kind of coordination in your industry that I'm seeing with cattle. Cattle, I guess they've got beef producers and they're hooked in with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. I think there needs to be some kind of coordination as well among your various groups to make sure that your message is getting out, because it is such a powerful one.
Any other quick questions? If not, I think we've probably stolen a bunch of Danielle's time. Maybe she'll be around for a little bit for a bit of networking, because we're going to be able to do some networking over some drinks and some appies, and then the 5 o'clock live 4-H auction to raise some money for 4-H. Can you join with me in thanking Danielle Smith?
Thank you.